The UK band Corner Shop, who had a hit with Brimful of Asha, all in the 90s, were incorporating sitars into their rock music. They did a wonderful cover of Norwegian Wood, which is the very first rock song which had sitar on it, George Harrison's first sitar. They did a cover of it, but they did the lyrics in Punjabi. And those cultural mixings and those hybridities are what fascinate me.
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. I'm Dan Gable, Technology Manager for the LRC. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week, on Speaking of Language,
we speak with Daniel Bass of Cornell's South Asia program and host of WRFI's Monsoon Radio about music, cultures, and languages.
Welcome to a new episode of Speaking of Language. I'm Angelika Kramer, the director of the Language Resource Center at Cornell University.
And I'm Sam Lupowitz, the LRC's Media Development Manager. Today, we welcome Daniel Bass to the studio. Dr. Bass is the manager of the South Asia program and adjunct assistant professor of anthropology and Asian studies at Cornell. He is also the host for a local radio show called Monsoon Radio, and we will talk about music across cultures today.
Welcome to Speaking of Language, Daniel.
Thank you both for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we start talking about your interest in music and music across cultures, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself? What's your story? What's your path, your experience with different cultures and languages?
To put it short, I am, as you mentioned, the manager of the South Asia program here at Cornell. I've been here for nearly 3 years. I was trained as an anthropologist doing work in Sri Lanka and South India. I got first interested in South Asia when I was an undergraduate, and I went on a study abroad program to Sri Lanka and fell in love with the place, and then traveled around India for 6 weeks on my own, and came back, got fascinated by it, went to graduate school, wanted to pursue studying about South Asia some more. I started learning Tamil, which is a Dravidian language of South India. It's spoken by about 70 million people around the world. And to do research in Sri Lanka on Tamil tea plantation workers whose ancestors had migrated from South India in the late 19th and early 20th century. And Tamil is the minority language of Sri Lanka. And I also wanted to learn Sinhala, the majority language of Sri Lanka. And Sinhala is an Indo-European language, but the only place where it is taught in North America, actually, the only place where it is taught in this hemisphere is here at Cornell. And when I was in graduate school in the 90s, I actually came to Ithaca for a summer to take Sinhala when it was offered here at that point. I had a wonderful summer in Ithaca. And then many years later, when I was offered the job, I thought, this was a beautiful place in July and August.
Yes.
Lo and behold.
And I wanted to live here year-round. So I came back. And so one interesting thing is very much in doing anthropology is learning the local language, but especially in a place where language has been the main source of ethnic conflict and civil war, to be able to speak the language on both sides is helpful.
So this radio show that you host, Monsoon Radio, how did you end up doing that, and what's your path with music and your interest in music?
Well, I was interested in music long before I was interested in South Asia, going back to high school record collecting and going to basement punk rock shows. And when I was in undergraduate, I was heavily involved with the radio station there. This was in the early 90s, the grunge years, and it was a wonderful time to be involved in college radio. And I was music director of the station there and had a weekly show mostly playing indie rock. And that was when I was starting to get interested in South Asia. And I was getting into some South Asian music, usual entry points like Ravi Shankar and Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, and some of the releases on Peter Gabriel's Real World label and David Byrne's Luwaka Bop, some of the first world music to kind of enter into the American marketplace in the 90s. But then when I went to graduate school at the University of Michigan, I became a fan of a show there called Sounds of the Subcontinent. And the student who was hosting that show was leaving to go do her dissertation research and needed a sub. And so I went on, and I was wanting to study more about South Asia. So I came as someone who's like fascinated about South Asia. I was spending my time learning about South Asian history and culture and language and religion. And, religion and music was just an extension of that. And so I was in education on air, and that's been 20-some years of doing that. So,
Do you play an instrument yourself?
no, I am utterly incapable of playing really much of any musical instrument myself. This is all living vicariously through others. I played trumpet for a year in 4th grade. My daughter's an amazing piano and keyboard and viola player. My son's a percussionist. I live through, I'm happy that they're playing. I listen to other people's playing. I can operate the mixing board. That's my contribution. But no, I'm not a musician myself, so this is very much a fan's appreciation.
Well, so I'm interested. You sort of answered the follow-up line of questioning that we were going to do about how your interest in music and your interest in South Asian language and culture intersected. So I'm wondering, music being a big part of my background, you talked about one of your entry points musically being through Western artists who were promoting or integrating South Asian music and other world musics. I feel like sometimes when we get into Western artists who sort of adopt the music of other cultures, it can be something new and exciting and different, but there can also be a little bit of tension around the robbing of a culture and that sort of thing. I know, like you'd mentioned Peter Gabriel. I think more of like Paul Simon with Graceland and that sort of thing. And it's a very open question. But I'm wondering if you have
I think
perspective
you don't rob a culture, but you can clearly rob musicians. The problem with Graceland was because he didn't pay the people.
Oh, well, there's that.
And also it's an issue of copyright going back to someone like Led Zeppelin doing blues artists and not crediting Willie Dixon for it. One thing that Peter Gabriel, for example, is really good is not only crediting the musicians in the liner notes, crediting them as authors and providing the royalties and those things. That is the key. Nobody owns culture.
Sure.
It is something, especially music, is something that's always a history of being hybrid and a lot of movement, and it moves faster than people do. But one of the key things is who's getting paid and how they're getting paid. And so I think that is the way to show respect for another culture, to treat people as collaborators. And so I think some of the better Western artists who've done that have been much more long-term. I think, George Harrison is an example of doing that, although of later involvement, though there are some Beatles tracks like The Inner Light and Within You, Without You, where it is a bunch of Indian musicians who were not credited. That was not the case in the late 60s. In his later work, in his solo work in the 70s and 80s, he did have much more direct involvement and credit them. But his, interest and passion was kind of one of the earlier uses of world music. And one of the interesting things is that starting in the 90s, you started to see music by people of Indian heritage in the West, incorporating them. So one example is the UK band Corner Shop, who had a hit with Brimful of Asha. But they very early on in the 90s were incorporating sitars into their rock music. They did a wonderful cover of Norwegian Wood, which is the very first rock song which had Indian musicians on it, had sitar on it, George Harrison's first sitar. They did a cover of it, but they did the lyrics in Punjabi.
Oh, wow.
And so these back and forth, and those cultural mixings and those hybridities are what fascinate me.
Yeah.
More than like a sense of a pure culture or kind of folk recordings. It's these interesting mixes. And it went back to the 1960s and 70s. So there's a lot of Indian film music, just as these Western rock musicians were interested in India. These Indian film musicians are bringing in guitars and Western rock sounds into them. And so you have these kind of fascinating hybrids forming and, on the basis of decades of cultural mixing.
That's so cool. So last night, actually, just very fortuitously, I was looking for a new Netflix show to watch, and I had 20 minutes, and it needed to be a short one. And I came across the show Explained. I don't know if either of the two of you know about the show. And the first episode is actually Explained Music. And they talk about the fact that every culture has music in some way, shape, or form. And that music really, other than language, right, is one thing that unites cultures and that is similar in different cultures. And one thing that they talked about that was fascinating to me is that while we all share music and appreciation for music, and while the intersection of music and language is actually a very close one, there are cultural differences. And they mention an example of in Western cultures, the major scale usually invokes like happiness, right? It's a positive type of vibe that you get off that. But in Balinese culture, and they played a sample of this, it's actually a song that's associated with cremation ceremonies. That is so interesting to me. Do you have more like examples, or can you think of any like differences, in some of the music that you've encountered, some of the music that you like to listen to, or maybe something that you've played on your radio show where you personally notice like differences or something that was unexpected maybe, or something where you learned something about a different culture?
Well, that's very interesting. That I think that interest, also that difference of the scales in the Bengali cremation. I'm totally thinking off the cuff here. It might be something of assuming that a funeral is necessarily a sad event, but it also can be a celebratory event
Sure,
where you're
sure.
celebrating someone's lives. Something specific like that, I have to be honest, I don't know, because
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't hear major. I don't know. Can't read music. I don't know what a major scale or minor scale
Okay.
is. I can't hear the key of something.
Yeah.
Right.
I know about as much when ragas explain, and it's in a beat in Tintal, which is a cycle. I think Tintal's like 14 beats or something. It's 16 beat cycle, as much as something's in
Yeah.
7/4 time in the key of G. Like both of those are, I have a limited knowledge, so I see them very equally. So
Sure,
in some
sure.
ways, my lack of musical ability allows me to be listen to this music without those preconceptions of the form. So I'm not as much interested in the form
Yeah.
of
Sure.
the music. I'm sure there are all sorts of things like that.
Oh, I
but,
bet, yeah. I don't know any of those either.
a lot of it is, some of it is also how, I listen to some like religious music, but I'm not a follower of that. So, playing like Pakistani or Indian Qawwali music, which is Sufi devotional music, which provides a very different experience if you are a believer and if you
Sure.
understand the words.
Yeah.
And for me, as someone, if I'm hearing something sung in Urdu, I don't understand the lyrics, but I can still feel the emotion. And so for me, I listen to a lot of music that is sung in a different language, but I can still understand it. And I find it very similar to listening some noisy rock in the 90s where you can barely hear the vocals over
Yeah.
the distorted guitars, but you can still feel the emotion
Sure.
that they're singing. And, I approach South Asian music, world music, where I don't know the language in the same way. So it's more about conveying the emotion through a song. Like you can tell if you don't know the language, what's
Yeah.
a love song, for example, or kind of the power of devotion. In terms of those kind of more formal things of something in another context, I'll probably think of something after I leave the studio. But at the moment, I can't think of anything, and I wish I could had a good answer for you, because that's a really good question.
Well, and you're talking about an experience like something that I am fairly musically literate. I have experiences with that where I can appreciate the music outside of its intended context. I mean, I think of like I love gospel music. It hits me right in the heart, and I'm like an agnostic Jewish kid from the suburbs. Like I have no connection to that outside of loving the music, even though it's meant as devotional music. So I'm interested in that, and we're talking a lot about cultural commonalities where music is a meeting place for emotional needs, regardless of where it's from, as opposed to the differences. And I remember I had a professor in my undergrad who sort of went out of his way to challenge me on my preconceived notions of music as being sort of a harmonizing force and a unifying force, and tried to show me examples of music being used as a battle cry and as a weapon. So I'm interested in those opposing forces, as music as unifier and music as antagonist.
Yeah, and there's sometimes when I'm doing my show on WRFI where I'm kind of interested in the culture and the history of the music, and I'm kind of explaining behind it how they use it. And other times, but other times I just play a song and it's got a good beat and you can dance to it,
Yep.
and appreciate it for its musical qualities as much as anything else.
Yeah.
So some of it is also, but trying to be, provide a little bit of context, I know the audience for my show is not people familiar with South Asian culture. It's a broad audience. Most people are tuning in because they're just interested in new sounds.
Yeah.
And that is generally the mission of community radio. And so provide something that's not available elsewhere. So I play a mix from all over South Asia. So I'll play some music from India next to something from Pakistan, next to something from, the U.S. or the U.K. or from the diaspora. I sometimes would go play some Central Asian music or Southeast Asian music or Arabic music. Of trying to mix this all up and finding these connections based on some certain theme or idea. So there's some shows where I'm much more thinking of trying to provide something more kind of educational and a cultural path.
Okay.
Remember one I did just last year, I think, to celebrate Nowruz, which is the Persian New Year. And I played music from as many cultures that I counted that celebrated Nowruz. And it was a lot of, well, not only Persian speaking, but many Central Asian, like, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, over to Azerbaijan, parts of Pakistan, and just kind of finding, using this holiday as this excuse to kind of find these connections among various cultures. And so sometimes I will have some theme that kind of brings it all together. Other times it's just, I got this new LP and it's really good and I want to play some more from it.
Yeah. Yeah, the connections between cultures and music are interesting. One other thing that's fascinating for me is the connection with language and music. Sometimes when you struggle with language, so we know this when people, parts of their brain don't function anymore and they can't speak, they can sing the language. And that's just so interesting to me. So a lot of people who have problems with speech and they go through therapy, music helps them find their voice again, find their language again.
Yeah, and I guess it's, probably some neurologist can tell you it's a different part of the brain or something like that.
It is, yes.
But it's just how much I can sing along to songs in languages I don't speak, and I know them, and, I might not necessarily know the words, and I realize I've often misinterpreted them, but, I've misinterpreted plenty of English language rock lyrics in my life.
There.
So I think there might, there's definitely something to that, and it provides this kind of different window into a culture through kind of language and music. Then it's accessible to everyone, and so even if you don't speak it, you get some feel for it in a way you might not otherwise.
So do you have a specific cultural region that's your number one for music, or you don't? You can't narrow it down to one? Might be a tough question.
I go through it's often I go through phases of like what I've been, getting in, I'll get into something and discover some artists and be very interested in that. So whether it is, there's some of their go-to favorites, the Hindi film composer R.D. Burman, who was in the 60s and 70s, very popular, incorporated a lot of rock and then later funk into his music. His wife was Asha Bhosle, one of the most famous Indian playback singers. The Tamil composer Ilayaraja, who was in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, very prominent. And he started bringing in a lot of like kind of electronics and synthesizers into it. But also on that line, Ananda Shankar, who did some film work in the early 70s, nephew of Ravi Shankar. And then there's like this label from the UK in the early 2000s called Outcast that had a lot of kind of the Asian underground, as it was called. And it was at this moment where that kind of like British dance culture, the rhythms, especially jungle, started mirroring Indian rhythms. So there'd be these electronic artists like Nitin Sawhney or Bad Martian Shri, who's using electronic rhythms, but they sounded like Indian rhythms, but they were also kind of a hit in the British clubs. So those are often my go-to favorite things. But then suddenly I will discover things like when I discovered this new artist last year called Grand Tapestry, who is a hip-hop trio from Los Angeles, which includes a rapper, a sarod player, and a tabla player, and basically combining Indian classical music with hip-hop, and it shouldn't work, the combination, one of those.
Sounds
But
awesome.
But it's awesome.
that
So
out.
some of these things are just, I will discover something, or I did a show earlier this month on Indian influences on jazz, and I discovered the work of this Jamaican saxophonist Joe Harriott and John Mayer, who is an Indian pianist, not the contemporary rock musician. And they had these two records called the Indo-Jazz Suites in the mid-'60s that are just amazing mix of Indian sounds and jazz, and like the way that improvisation in jazz and Indian classical music combine wonderfully well. And so it's just this, like, I went down this rabbit hole for weeks of just these finding new combinations. And the internet is remarkable in what is available now, rather than searching through dusty bins in record stores as I did decades ago, and still do today, actually.
Yes. Let's say one of our listeners wants to tune into Monsoon Radio. Can you let them know what's the best way for them to listen?
The best way to listen to is if you're in the Ithaca area every other Tuesday night on WRFI 88.1 FM. You can also stream it online at WRFI.org. The past few weeks of shows are archived as well. So if you didn't hear me like last night, you can go and listen to it online. The links are at WRFI.org. You can also follow me online. I have a Facebook page. It's Monsoon Radio WRFI, all one word. And there I post information about the show, post information about other South Asian musical events going on in the Ithaca area, and I post the playlists of all my shows afterwards, so you can go and find the artists.
Nice.
Excellent.
This is so
Next week.
interesting.
I love this. This is I could sit and talk about
Yeah,
this all
next
day.
week.
I could too. It's like, this is my hobby. That's the other thing I forgot to say, is that I actually went to grad school thinking I wanted to study popular culture in South Asia. Then I realized that the academic study of popular culture takes all the fun out of it. What's great about popular culture, it's immediate. And, academia is all about distance. It's about getting distance in perspective, and then distance because if you submit something for publishing, it appears in a journal 2 to 3 years later. Yep. And I realized that I wanted to use my kind of language and knowledge to study something more important. So I looked at issues of kind of politics and identity and diaspora and citizenship, but I could have a hobby. And so radio has been my hobby in a way to understand South Asia in a very immediate way. And that has been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Glad to share it with all of you.
Fantastic.
Perfect. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for joining us today on Speaking of Language.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure to be down here and to talk to you.
Next week, we will speak with Sarah Lee. Sarah is a lecturer in German at Arizona State University and is also a certified K-12 and dyslexia therapist. We will talk to her about how to best support dyslexic learners in the second language learning process. Until then, auf Wiederhören!
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu or look for Cornell LRC on Facebook and Twitter. Speaking of Language is produced by Sam Lupowitz and Dan Gable. Recorded by Sam Lupowitz. Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson. Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University. As a reminder, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Sciences or any other official entity of Cornell University. We thank our listeners, and do stay tuned for our next episode.